The reading is taken from Nehemiah 2, 11 to 20. So I came to Jerusalem and was there for 3 days. Then I got up during the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one that my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the animal I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate, past the Dragon Spring and the Dung Gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the animal I was riding to continue. So I went up by way of the valley by night and inspected the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest that were to do the work. Decision to restore the walls. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we may no longer suffer disgrace." I told them that the hand of my God had been gracious upon me, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. Then they said, "Let us start building." So they committed themselves to the common good. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they mocked and ridiculed us, saying, "What is this that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" Then I replied to them, "The God of heaven is the one who will give us success, and we, his servants, are going to start building. But you have no share or claim or historic right in Jerusalem." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, shall we pray? Gracious God, we ask that you will speak to us through your word and that we may hear your voice and do your will. In Jesus' name, amen. So, here we are, Nehemiah once again. We've actually swapped about a bit in the book of Nehemiah. We had an overview of the book. We had a look at Nehemiah and vision. We had a look at Nehemiah and prayer. And last week we were in chapter 4, looking at the problems that Nehemiah and his colleagues faced. So here we are, logically, after chapter 4, in chapter 2. This week, we're having a bit more of a look at the man, Nehemiah, and how he navigates through all of this. We've had a lot of discussion this week about leadership. We've had discussion about whether certain people are best referred to as leaders or as cowards, and whether they need to apologise for such words. We've had a lot of not very edifying discussion. I use that as a word for some heated exchanges in Parliament this week, as well as lots of discussion about whether leaders keep their promises or not, about whether leaders place public service before private gain or not, and so on. We've had a lot of discussion about this word leadership this week. Now, one thing that's clear about Nehemiah is that what he is doing is not about power or personal gain. Nehemiah, as we saw right at the start, actually has quite a high up position in the court of a king. He has the comfortable lifestyle of a senior civil servant. We don't know what he was paid, but it was generally quite a comfortable lifestyle. He worked for a king called Artaxerxes. This is a real figure that we know quite a bit about, actually, from secular history. He was the grandson of Darius I of Persia. The reason why we have the race called the Marathon is to do with the fact that there was a battle at a place called Marathon. It's nothing to do with chocolate bars. There was a battle at a place called Marathon, and that was between the Greeks and the Persians, and on one side was Artaxerxes' grandfather, Darius I. He had a son called Xerxes I, who, despite being the big bad villain in the 300 films, actually was real, though probably not 9 foot tall. If you've watched those films, just bear in mind there's a great big historical warning on all of that stuff. Artaxerxes was then son of Xerxes I. He was not famed for being a soft touch. He came to the throne of Persia and Media after successfully putting down an attempted coup in which both his father and his 2 elder brothers had been killed. And so when Nehemiah comes to him looking glum in public before the king, that's actually an incredibly risky maneuver. Persian kings and emperors had something of a reputation for getting rid of civil servants who were not on the right page. And actually turning up in front of the king looking unhappy was a major faux pas, which could lead to you losing your head, or indeed actually historically recorded other body parts, depending on how the emperor or king was feeling at that particular time. So Nehemiah takes a massive risk at communicating his concern to the king. And what's he concerned about? He has heard news that the walls of Jerusalem have fallen. And he asks his king to basically take time off work to go and attend to what Artaxerxes will have thought of as a frankly unimportant backwater of his empire. Now, as we saw a couple of weeks back, the first thing Nehemiah does when he hears the news is actually he prays. Some of the stuff that I'm going to be saying this morning might be fairly generic stuff, the sort of stuff you could read in any how to do good leadership book, and there's a whole pile of them around, but it's worth putting in context of the fact that the first thing he does is pray. And continually when Nehemiah talks about what happens, he puts it in the context of what God is doing and has done. He talks not in terms of what a great and skilled leader he is, but in terms of God's favour and graciousness. Remarkably and amazingly, who knows, it might be an answer to prayer, Artaxerxes is having a good day. And he says yes. Go off and look at this place called Jerusalem with the restless natives that I've heard a certain amount about. And Nehemiah, the book and the man, is clear that this is because of God's prompting of Nehemiah in the first place, and then God's faithfulness in granting him favour in the king's sight. So, before we start looking at anything about Nehemiah and leadership, we look at the fact that actually his leadership is in the context of God's grace and God's activity. I'm pretty sure that, as most observant Jews of the time would know, there's a psalm that says that unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labour in vain. Now, I'm actually glad that we had chapter 4 last week because it has in it a fairly relevant verse for what we're talking about this week, and probably my favourite verse in the whole book, which is in chapter 4. It says, "We prayed to God and we posted guards." Some of the time people think all we need to do is pray. Some of the time people think, no, prayer is a waste of time, let's act. Actually, Nehemiah says you do both. It is not unspiritual to post guards at the same time as praying, and it is not impractical to be praying to God. So, here we are in chapter 2, and again we have that thing about prayer and the action of God united with the action of Nehemiah as an individual and the people around him. Now, I have to confess, I spend quite a bit of my time talking about this leadership word and a bit of thinking about what we mean by that word. One of my favourite definitions of leadership, fairly generic, is rallying people to a better future. Rallying people to a better future. The idea that leadership is about seeing the current situation, seeing that it is not as good as it could be, helping other people to engage with where they are, and holding forward a vision of where they could be going to, of a better future. And then, as one writer I'm fond of says, helping people engage with the pain of moving from the present to the future. Because it's going to mean change and it's going to mean difficulty. As we said last week, following Jesus is never going to be a free ride or a charmed life, and things will not always be great. And it's not unspiritual or lacking in faith to be honest about what is not good. And the first thing that Nehemiah does is he looks at what is and says, oh, this really isn't good. He has heard the news about Jerusalem's walls having been broken down, and he goes to see it for himself. And he goes to engage with the reality of what they're facing. Some of you may well have come across the fact there's a very famous book by a guy called John Cotter from Harvard Business School about penguins. Well, it's not about penguins. It's about engaging with change. The book is called Our Iceberg Is Melting. And one of the first things that they say about engaging with change is to engage with reality and the urgency of the situation. A couple of weeks back, we had a preach related to COP26. One of the striking images that has stuck with me was the foreign minister of the small island nation of Tuvalu addressing the conference knee-deep in water. He was knee-deep in water because he was standing on land that over the past years has been lost to rising sea levels in an island nation where the majority of the land is only 2 meters above the current sea level. I was at Diocesan Synod a couple of weeks back and we were talking a bit about the environment, and somebody very strikingly said, we are twinned with the Solomon Islands. If we are not engaging with this, the Solomon Islands will no longer be islands, they will be underwater. There's something here in what we see with Nehemiah about engaging with reality, no matter how painful it is. And just as it broke his heart to hear of it from far, far away, it breaks his heart all over again up close. So there's something about engaging with where we really are. And very often in church world, we see a bit of a sort of lack of engagement with the reality of where we are. It'll all be fine. We needn't worry about doing anything. We don't want to look at the figures because the figures are very uncomfortable and we don't like that. We don't want to feel uncomfortable. Thank you very much. Rather than engaging with where we are and maybe registering the fact that what we've been doing for ages has got us to where we are now. So maybe God's calling us to do something different. Just as world leaders are having to engage with and look at the reality of something like global climate change, so church leaders and communities need to be realistic about the consequences of carrying on doing what we've always been doing as if the world has not changed and things are not urgent. Now, you'll note that I said there it's about church leaders and communities. And if there's one truth I want you to carry away from this morning, though actually I'd still go back to that one from chapter 4, we prayed and we posted guards. Prayer and action are not mutually exclusive, they go together. Okay, but from chapter 2, it's this, that leadership often feels lonely, but definitely needs not to be alone. Leadership is not a thing you can do on your own. One organisation that I used to work with were fond of saying leadership is a plural word. It is a team game. Can you play tennis on your own? Can you play football, ice hockey or water polo on your own? there are some things that actually have to be done together. One of my other favourite quotes about leadership is, anyone who says they are a leader yet walks on their own is just somebody going for a walk. It's about rallying people to a better future. And so it has to involve others, which is what we see Nehemiah doing. Now, I don't know about you, but when you heard that reading or when you've read this through, I often think of Nehemiah on his own on a donkey, having this secret trip under cover of darkness, because this is quite a dangerous assignment, having a secret trip on his own, wandering around. He's not on his own. Even at this point, he says he takes a few men with him. Already, he is enlisting others. He's not yet told everybody, but as verse 16 spells out, even at this early stage, he is not on his own. Now, my guess is that he feels the weight of this more keenly than the people who are with him. And leadership will often feel lonely and isolated. I spend quite a lot of my time at the moment talking about the reality of the fact that for church leaders, people particularly called into positions of principal leadership in churches, the last 18 months have been pretty hard going. In the past couple of weeks, I've had at least 4 conversations with clergy and church leaders who are saying, I'm just worn out and I'm not sure I can carry on. And I think there's a reality there again, which I think a number of people in church world are not necessarily engaging with. So, are we praying for and recognizing the burden that lies on our leaders in church and in the world more generally? I know I started off by saying various things about what's been a fairly unedifying set of political exchanges this week. But also, I really take seriously the New Testament's command to pray for those who are in secular authority. In the New Testament, it says, pray for your leaders. And just pause and remember, that is not to do with the quality of the leaders or whether you agree with them. Because at that point, they were talking about people like Tiberius, Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and others. Roman emperors not noted for being marvellous people of integrity and Christian character. We should be praying for those in leadership in church and in the world. And part of what we should be praying for is that they have good people around them. Nehemiah wisely does not do this alone. After his secret visit to the walls, he goes to the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest. I love this, to all of the people who'd be doing the work. Okay? And he shares with them the sobering reality. And he goes through that leadership task. Here is where we are. Here is where we could go. How do we get from one to the other? It's interesting, he doesn't impose his will. He doesn't actually say, this is what we are going to do. He goes to them and shares what's on his heart and what he has seen. He spells out the situation and invites them to join in. And interestingly, he does encourage. He says, yes, this is the reality, but also part of the reality is that we have a God who has given us favour in the eyes of the king. And with somebody like Artaxerxes, you don't take that for granted. This is the situation. It is urgent. And yet also, this is God. This is the God whom we serve, who has brought us favour in practical ways. And how do they respond? They respond by saying, let us start building. And they committed themselves to it. I've spoken about this from here before, but a number of years ago, when I was running a thing for clergy about team working, a bit of a penny dropped for me, which was this. If you were going to think you could do it all on your own, then your best excuse for thinking you could do that would be being the Son of God. And Jesus does not do it on his own. One of the first things Jesus does in his ministry is that he calls a bunch of people to be around him. He gathers others around him. And that was a penny dropper for me. If that's good enough for Jesus, then actually am I, in my constant temptation to do things on my own, thinking, well, I'm better than Jesus, really. Nehemiah gathers others around him. Some of you will know it's not a Christian quote. There's a well-known quote about leadership from the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who says, "Of a good leader, it is one who says little, listens much, and when the work is done, the people say, 'We did it ourselves.'" This is not about power or authority or status. Nehemiah never says, "Look, I'm important. I work for Artaxerxes. I'm important." He doesn't pull those sorts of rank, but he simply says, this is the situation, and God is calling us to do something. And it's interesting what he says about the motivation. He says, so that we may no longer suffer disgrace. Now, I don't think that's just about saying, look, guys, we're looking bad here. I think it's probably linked to, and that word in particular is linked to a lot of stuff, again in the Psalms, which says the motivation is about not so much whether Israel looks bad, but whether by extension the God of Israel looks bad. And very often you'll see people in the Old Testament praying to God and saying, Lord, do something. This is making you look bad among the nations. And we do not want people saying our God is weak or a disgrace. There's stuff about the trouble that they are in, about the practical danger, but I suspect more about the reputation and glory of God. And Nehemiah calls these people to join with him to enter discomfort and pain and difficulty for the glory of God. And finally, I'm holding out hope, aren't I? Finally, a lesson about leadership is expect opposition and do not panic when it happens. Again, there's a bit of the loneliness here, because when opposition comes up, do they go to all of the people Nehemiah has gathered around him? No, they just go to Nehemiah. He's the guy who is in the firing line when it comes to the opposition. I've mentioned a whole bunch of people, from Chinese philosophers to business writers and the Bible and so on. Again, a final favourite quote about leadership is from the animated movie A Bug's Life. The point at which somebody in a position of leadership says to somebody else, "It's not my fault. Somebody else didn't do what they were supposed to do." And at this point, the character leans forward and says, "First lesson of leadership, Your Highness, it's always your fault." Nehemiah is the guy who gets the brunt of the criticism from the people that they are up against. And what criticism it is. There's a really entertaining comment here where they say, "What is this that you're doing?" They mock and they ridicule. And then they say, "What's this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? You know, that king who came to power because he was suppressing a palace rebellion led by a bunch of senior civil servants." You, really. Are you the person who appears to be building a fortress for a bunch of notoriously restless natives in a far-flung point of the empire? Are you rebelling against the king? This is sharp and pointy stuff. And Nehemiah does not shoot back with any sort of unpleasantness. He doesn't pull rank, because actually he's talking to minor provincial officials and he's just come from the palace. He doesn't say anything about having the authority of the king behind him. Well, he does, but it's a different king. What does he say? He says, "The God of heaven is the one who will give us success, and we, his servants, are going to start building." So again, we're back to that thing about saying the context here is that this is someone who doesn't think the best response to slinging mud is, well, more mud. He replies calmly and clearly and says, this is about what God is doing and us joining in with it. So what do we do with some of this stuff? Well, there's an obvious plot here, isn't there, in terms of a church that's embarking on a building project, talking about, a building project, and leadership, and so on. What is God calling us to do? I think there probably is something here about praying for those who are in leadership of that particular project and this particular church at this particular time. There's something here about an awareness of loneliness, but also of not being alone. Because God calls us to do this stuff together, and to realize that this is not a situation in which we can just pile it on to somebody else. The number of points when I talk to people who say, what are vicars for? They're to do all of the stuff. Really not. Actually, leadership is about getting some things done and getting them done together. There is a specific role of rallying people to that better future, of engaging with reality, of seeing that better future and saying, how do we get from A to B, and embracing the pain as well as being encouraged by God's grace. But whether this is about our current church situation or indeed about global pandemics and climate crisis and so on, I think maybe, and this is certainly what's hit home for me, there's something about saying, how do we join in with the people who are not named in this narrative, who are not Nehemiah and not the opposition, the people who are the ones who will do the work, who are gathered around Nehemiah and say, yes, we see things how they are, we recognize the urgency, and under God we will join with you. Will we, as it says here, commit ourselves to the common good? Recognize where we are, and under God seek to move to the better future that God calls us to. May God give us all grace to hear his word and to be doers of it. Amen.